Okay, good morning. We'd like to begin with a confession. We love France and most things French. Gary says that how could you not love a country that has a stamp issued like this? To the great baguette. We spend as much time there as possible, and over the years we've conducted several research projects, particularly in Paris. But it's a small village in the south of France, removed from the excitement of the Côte d'Azur, about 90 miles, 90 minutes from Nice, 60 minutes from Aix-en-Provence. It's always tourist-filled. And it's a village of 2,254 people, surrounded by vineyards and olive trees and lavender fields. It's a rural place with a very long history. Cognac is a town dominated by a cliff known to the locals as La Touffe. It's a proud and active community which mixes locals and artists and kindred spirits from abroad. And we wanted to understand more about the place that we love, and we thought that we could try to bring our understanding from years of studying general semantics, along with our studies of public memory, to our town. One of us has owned a place there for over 30 years. His front door. And one of us is presently scouring the real estate listings. I'm hoping to get something before what they call the Clooney effect kicks in. He bought a place about 2 villages over and comes to our local market. So one of the things about the French is that they remember. And we've been present for all sorts of holidays and commemorations. And we've seen many events over the years. Recently, the Victory in Europe Day, in which there's real holiday vibe that fills the main street. There's a flag procession that makes its way to the Hotel de Ville, and speeches are made, wreaths are laid, and the sound of the Marseillaise echoes off the towering cliffs. Just salute. We'd like everyone to sing along, but we'll skip it this time. Basically, we've been there in August where American military vehicles flying American flags parade through the streets of the village, and French and American flags dominate the streets. They throw in a few British and Canadian flags as well, covering surrounding buildings, all sorts of events taking place in Cognac and the surrounding villages. But there are other days that we've seen commemorated that made less sense to us, and where the story of what went on in that village during World War II remained very vague or not spoken of. When we're not in the village, we watch much French television. And it was a series entitled The French Village. Any of you see that? It's a great series. We highly recommend it. But it's really a series that tied into what we felt we were missing of our understanding of the village, and in particular, and France more generally. This drama tells the story of a village under occupation, German occupation during World War II, and how there were very complex effects on the inhabitants of a small village. One reviewer said that it leaves the viewer with the overriding question, what would I have done? That same reviewer went on to note, the series is said to be the first time French television came to grips with the reality of occupation. It accepts neither the grand myth about the time, not the one popular for decades in France, in which all the French were noble resistance fighters who despised the Nazis, but also not the counter-narrative popular elsewhere that they were all cowardly, sometimes eager collaborators.
This brings us to the role of symbols and language in shaping our understanding of the time and the present. We began to delve into those issues by looking at commemorative sites in and around the village. Some of you may have heard us on the topic early in the summer, or some people may have heard of us. We have been focused on the memorials to the resistance within the environment of Courtinac. One is called Monument de la Resistance. It lies on the road outside of the village, technically in a neighboring hamlet of Ponty, just across from one of our favorite villages. The central plaque lists the names of the resistance fighters killed on a particular day, July 27, 1944, on the local mountain. Another can be found in front of the Hotel de Ville and lists the names of those killed. It is primarily affixed to the front of the memorial to those from the village killed in World War II and World War I. The nearby street is named after a former resident killed in the massacre of the resistors on July 22nd. All of this speaks to the question, or begs the question, who were the resistors? Why is the term resistor or resistance essential to understanding the present? A bit of historical context is necessary. In the spring of 1940, Germany quickly invaded and defeated France. The French government's response was a one-sided armistice that continues to haunt the nation. It's always been my theory that the French go for lunch at 1 o'clock and close at 2. And it must have been at that time that the Germans invaded. That's not in here. The armistice signed by Adolf Hitler. I cannot talk about Adolf Hitler without thinking of the Prussian present campaign in the United States. Anyhow, back to that. The armistice signed by Adolf Hitler and the leader of France, Marshal Pétain, divided the country geographically into two large sections, one occupied by Germany and one designated as a free, governed by a new regime in the town of Vichy. It was known as the Vichy province. The area in which our village can be found is in the Var, which is under the control, or was under the control, of the Vichy government. Some neighboring villages included Villacrosse and, I love to say that, actively collaborated with the Vichy government. The Var was not a major combat zone prior to the liberation. The Italian forces were the first external presence. The German presence became significant in the war once Italy capitulated in September of 1943. Reports indicate this area was not a hotbed of resistance. In 1940-42, resistance groups in this region often consisted of a small number, and then they hid. According to a dissertation entitled Rural France, War, Commemoration, and Memory, the relationship between the past and the present. German propaganda dominated the radio, and BBC broadcasts and Charles de Gaulle's messages from London were fiercely forbidden. Any spark of resistance of such activity, such as the Humanité de Var, was quickly dismantled by the Vichy police.
In our inquiries regarding the occupation of France and life in the village, we asked and had conversations with many people, interviewed people, and 3 words repeatedly emerged: resistance, collaboration, and victim. How did these language choices relate to the present reality in which, for some, the past remains hidden, and for others, the past is celebrated? To help us in this endeavor, we turn to S.I. Hayakawa's abstraction ladder, introduced in Language and Thought in Action, and we hope that this would help us deal with the relationship of generalization and the specific, help us navigate between concrete realities and abstract ideas. Now, while we're not experts in the work of Hayakawa, we think that looking at these terms in relation to the ladder of abstraction helps shed light on the collective French myth of their response to the occupation. It is the consciousness of the French, what they think of themselves after the occupation and the present day, that is at the heart of our inquiry. The country still grapples with reckoning with its history and the aftermath of World War II. Each word encompasses a wide range of behaviors and attitudes ranging from active to passive. Now, in the interest of time, we'll move quickly through each of these terms. To start out, the Nazis came to my country, the French people, and told me to resign myself, but I couldn't do it, so I took up my gun. And this was a statement that we found in a local museum dedicated to the resistance. Thank you, Mary, for helping us with this quote. At the bottom of the rung of the ladder of abstraction, we find the most concrete, specific, detailed, tangible. These words denote the real in a physical sense. Now, the word resistance was not widely used during the war. They really referred to it as these activities as clandestine or secret. We look to the etymology of the word resistance, and it comes from the French resistance or the Latin resistencia, and it meant to hold back. And it wasn't until 1939 that the word came to mean an organized covert opposition to an occupying or ruling power. From the beginning of the occupation, the German occupation, some refused to accept defeat with predominantly individual or uncoordinated acts of opposing the enemy. Resistance ranged from independent acts to organized acts on a large scale of sabotage. The resistance in rural areas was called the maquis, so the maquis external. And ultimately, the activities ranged, this said, from kind of passive actions to very active actions of sabotage. Some resistors engaged in printing and distributing clandestine newspapers to rally support for liberating France, while others broadcast clandestine anti-German, anti-Vichy radio programs. Some engaged in sabotaging telecommunications networks, while others engaged in trying to provide information to Allied sources. Others became engaged with trying to blow up important infrastructure, like bridges. Some went so far as to try to assassinate German soldiers. And while the types of activities that marked the behavior of resistors could be considered less, some more, some with small gestures like simply refusing to speak to the occupiers. The bottom line is that with resistance, you were talking about acts of agency. Resistance was a matter of choice. It may have also been a matter of peer pressure. Now, we're running low on time. So in the interest of time, I think we should move along and just mention that the sorrow and the pity, the famous French documentary about the time of the occupation, really gets to the heart of the matter of how the differing meanings, interpretations of the concept of resistance took hold. And so for some, it was a patriotic move, for others, freedom fighters, for others, terrorists. I'm going to move on to collaborators. The collaborators, rather than the resistors. The resistors were concrete. We saw them, as we mentioned before, in street names, plaques as you walk down a village street, a local museum that featured all sorts of artifacts of those who resisted. And you got a sense that there were real people, that there was a real physical presence. When we move on to collaboration, we were struck by how it became more of a vague term. We were very impressed with a fictional story that encompassed the concept of collaboration. And in Daphne du Maurier's book, The Scapegoat, there's a passage in which an elderly woman explains that she was labeled a collaborator. It was a very moving story. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, we only have a minute left. She said, she said, you asked me about the occupation. They accused me of being a collaborator because of this boy. She holds up a snapshot of a young soldier in a German uniform. There was nothing very striking about him. He was not posing or smiling, merely young. What did he do, I asked. Do, she said, he did nothing. He was simply here for a few months with many others. He was in trouble one day. There was to be an inspection, and he had a stain on his uniform, messing with some dye. He came to me and asked in his sign language and with a mix of few words if I could clean it so that he would not be punished. I thought of my own two boys, Andre, who was a prisoner, and Albert, who was killed. And there was this boy of the same age standing there far from home asking me who could have been his mother to clean a stain on his jacket. Of course I cleaned it. And he came back afterwards and thanked me and gave me the snapshot. It made no difference to me whether he was German or Japanese or had fallen from the moon. He was no doubt killed later like many others. They were born to die, all those boys, ours as well. But because I had cleaned his jacket, the mayor of Saint-Gilles and many others did not speak to me for 2 years. So you see, when war comes to one's own village, one's own doorstep, it isn't just tragic and impersonal any longer. It's just an excuse to voice private hatred. That's why I'm not a great patriot and why I do not care to discuss the occupation of Saint-Gilles. And that's something that we found over and over again, that people would not talk. They said, this is not what we'll talk about. The bottom line is we trace collaboration and the concept of the word, the negative connotations that it developed, and We look at some of the work of people who were explaining, like Camus, explaining and justifying collaboration. And I'm just going to finish up. The bottom line is that what's happened in recent times is that this vague concept of what it meant to be a collaborator ranged from voluntary, where people embraced the notion of anti-Semitism, anti-communism, opportunism, self-defense reasons, sometimes just as a matter to survive. Some people describe it as we went along to get along. Files are recently being made public, revealing who the collaborators were. The French declassified 200,000 files in 2015. The Dutch have just done something similar. 1 minute, I'm negotiating, 1 minute. The last term, the most abstract term, victim. This is personal. I lived a good life, so I call myself can I call myself a Holocaust survivor? I do not bear a concentration camp tattoo, nor was I a hidden child. Is there some measurable degree of suffering that is necessary in order to be a Holocaust victim? So it is personal. Yari spent years asking a question of whether he could be considered a victim. Apparently, the definition of victim has changed over the years. So congratulations, today you're a victim. Years ago, you weren't. But in conclusion, trying to determine who were the victims, what we found is the French have a very strange history with regard to victimage. And we've spent years, actually gave a talk at the Players a number of years ago about memorials to the victims. And this particular memorial in Paris, we spent a lot of time on. This one is a memorial dedicated to all of those deported. And what we learned was at the time in 1962, when it was dedicated, the idea, de Gaulle's idea, was that you would keep broadening the concept of victim. It was originally supposed to be a memorial to resistors. Then it became a memorial to the deported of all nationalities. And now it's been expanded to the notion that everybody was a victim, that all of France were victims. And so you have this very increasingly broad, vague concept of the term victim. We go back to the ladder of abstraction and think it has been helpful in our understanding of the village. One man's victim is another person's collaborator. Is there a degree of guilt that we have detected in some of these commemorations that we've observed? The rituals of remembrance and commemoration practiced today reflect and shape the present. Current identity and collective memory of the past impact the lives and perhaps the politics of present-day France. So this brings us neatly to the theme of the symposium: communication, consciousness, and culture, but is it a guilty consciousness? Thank you.